Each year, the United States Department of Energy spends over $2.3 billion managing the environmental legacy of the Cold War's nuclear weapons program, maintaining security at sites where the most dangerous experiments in human history were conducted behind layers of classification that remain impenetrable even decades after the facilities were supposedly decommissioned. The Hanford site in southeastern Washington state spans an area of 586 square miles, making it larger than the city of Los Angeles, and between 1943 and 1987, it produced more than 20 million pieces of uranium metal fuel for 9 nuclear reactors, generating plutonium for approximately 60.00 nuclear weapons, including the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. During the height of the Cold War, between 1945 and 1990, over 120.00 workers passed through Hanford's gates, conducting research so sensitive that entire categories of experiments remain classified to this day, buried in archives that the government insists contain nothing more than routine operational data, despite the hundreds of millions spent annually maintaining security protocols for a site that's officially been shut down for over 3 decades. For a brief period during the late summer and early fall of 1979, one experimental reactor designated N7 in internal documents, but which appears on no official inventory or blueprint of the Hanford complex, became the site of a phenomenon so catastrophic and reality-defying that it required the immediate deployment of chemical weapons that, technically, didn't exist. The sacrifice of personnel whose families were told comfortable lies about radiation exposure, and the creation of an exclusion zone within an exclusion zone that remains sealed behind fences and armed patrols even now, 45 years after the incident occurred. But what exactly was the anomaly that manifested when reactor N7 achieved temperatures that nuclear physics insists are impossible? And why do satellite imaging systems still show a roughly 3-kilometer circular region near the center of Hanford where the colors are subtly wrong, where the geometry of shadows doesn't quite match the position of the sun, and where birds refuse to fly, even though radiation levels are supposedly within acceptable parameters? The Hanford site occupies 586 square miles of high desert scrubland in southeastern Washington state, a landscape so hostile and isolated that it was deliberately chosen in 1943 for Manhattan Project plutonium production, specifically because its remoteness would allow experiments with minimal civilian observation. The terrain features ancient basalt formations, unusual concentrations of crystalline minerals, and magnetic anomalies that have caused compass malfunctions since Lewis and Clark documented strange variations in our instruments in 1805. Summer temperatures routinely exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Annual rainfall averages less than 7 inches. And the Columbia River flows along the northern boundary with current patterns that have never quite matched hydrological models, occasionally reversing direction despite no changes in elevation or water volume. It is perhaps unsurprising then that when the Department of Energy needed a location to test experimental reactor designs pushing theoretical limits of nuclear physics, they chose a section of Hanford so remote that even other facility workers didn't know it existed, a zone designated only as Sector 7 Gamma and protected by security protocols requiring armed escorts even for top-secret cleared personnel. Indigenous peoples of the Columbia Basin maintained oral traditions about locations along the river being places where the world is thin, sites marked with petroglyphs depicting spiral patterns and beings with wrong numbers of limbs. And in 1842, Jesuit missionary Pierre Jean Smet documented that Yakama guides refused to camp in what would become Hanford's central zone, warning that the spirits there do not sleep as spirits should. In 1951, maintenance crews at B Reactor found concrete that had crystallized into organic growth patterns violating basic chemistry, samples that were immediately classified after 3 laboratories reported molecular bonds arranged in configurations never observed in nature. Between 1952 and 1978, security logs document 14 incidents of personnel experiencing temporal disorientation and missing time, with EEG readings showing patterns suggesting REM sleep while conscious and active. In March 1977, construction crews excavating for the N7 experimental reactor reached an underground cavity 200 feet down, a perfectly spherical chamber with polished walls showing basalt subjected to temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Celsius, far beyond any natural process. Rather than filling the anomaly as planned, the decision was made to build N7 directly above it, and between 1977 and 1979, security documented over 50 unexplained anomalous events, including equipment failures, severe nosebleeds in specific areas, and multiple accounts of shadow people visible in peripheral vision. But project leadership proceeded with testing despite internal safety concerns about what theoretical physicists believed the anomaly might enhance in ways conventional locations could not. September 17, 1979, 1500 hours, Sergeant Dylan Doc Whitmore, a 34-year-old nuclear containment technician and Vietnam veteran with top-secret clearance, was monitoring Reactor N7's first full-power test alongside 8 specialists, including 2 Los Alamos physicists, 3 Navy technicians, 1 Air Force colonel, and 2 Department of Energy technicians, whose names nobody could remember. 12 minutes into the power-up sequence toward 87% output, Doc noticed temperature sensors reporting impossible readings. One location at 3,847 degrees Celsius, while 6 inches away showed negative. 340 degrees below, absolute zero, and within 90 seconds, they'd identified 17 locations violating thermodynamic laws. The lights flickered. Everyone felt a sensation like the floor dropping away. And at 15:19 hours, when the reactor achieved target output, shadows began moving independently of the objects casting them. The control room temperature fluctuated wildly between freezing and sweltering, and monitors displayed views from camera angles that didn't exist. Navy Chief Petty Officer Lisa Hernandez started screaming that she could see herself doubled, occupying the same space in 2 slightly out-of-sync versions, while the smell of ozone mixed with organic rot intensified and radiation detectors spiked erratically in patterns. The health physics officer insisted, "Where impossible radiation doesn't behave like this." One Department of Energy technician calmly walked to the exit saying, "They want to show me something. They've been asking so politely," disappeared into an empty corridor captured on security cameras and was never seen again. At 15:27 hours, the reactor core achieved a state where temperatures read simultaneously at absolute zero and vaporization levels in security cameras somehow showed the interior through feet of steel shielding, revealing fuel assemblies occupying impossible positions that violated 3-dimensional geometry structures existing in multiple locations or extending in directions perpendicular to normal space. Dr. Raymond Caldwell from Los Alamos was weeping and saying, "We've created a localized violation of spatial constants," while Chief Hernandez collapsed, her doubled form now separated enough to see the gap between versions making sounds that suggested pain beyond human expression. Then physicist Dr. Richard Chon suddenly announced he understood that the reactor was creating thermal gradients across dimensional boundaries, manually overrode safety interlocks to push toward 100% output. And as every electronic system failed, Doc saw in the red emergency lighting that Chin's proportions had become wrong. His smile too wide, eyes reflecting green instead of red. And when Chun spoke, his voice was layered like a cord, saying, "Consciousness is what they've been waiting for. Temperature was never the variable. Attention was." Chun touched Hernandez's doubled form, and both versions collapsed into one body with luminescent skin and completely black eyes that extended forever. And at 15:32 hours, Doc shot Chun, twice watching the body collapse like a puppet, while blood became spreading darkness that absorbed light and bent gravity. As the Air Force colonel pulled everyone toward emergency exit, Doc looked back at monitors, showing the core had become a space where physics were negotiable, with shapes moving that weren't human, despite his brain's attempts to interpret them as such. Entities that the reactor hadn't created, but had simply made space for. And that realization was his last coherent thought before the emergency exit sealed, trapping whatever had manifested inside N7, along with anyone who couldn't escape in time. The 4 survivors who made it out of N7's control room: Sergeant Dylan Whitmore, Air Force Colonel James Reeves, Navy Lieutenant Marcus Petrov, and Petty Officer 3rd Class Amanda Torres, were immediately transported to a decontamination facility 3 miles from the reactor site, a prefabricated structure that had been erected with suspicious speed, as if someone had anticipated the need for emergency quarantine protocols before the incident even occurred. Doc Whitmore spent the first 6 hours in a sealed chamber, being subjected to decontamination procedures that went far beyond standard radiation protocols. Technicians in hazmat suits scrubbing his skin with chemical solutions that burned and left his flesh raw, drawing blood samples every 30 minutes, and conducting neurological scans using equipment he'd never seen in any military medical facility. The doctors wouldn't answer his questions about Chief Hernandez or the other personnel who'd been left behind in N7, and when he demanded to know the status of Dr. Chun's body, the lead physician simply stated that biological materials from the hot zone are being handled through specialized protocols in a tone that made it clear the subject was not open for discussion. Colonel Reeves was in an adjacent chamber, and through the observation window, Doc could see him being interrogated by 3 individuals in civilian clothes who took turns asking the same questions over and over, recording every response, comparing his account against written transcripts, looking for inconsistencies or signs that his memory had been compromised by whatever had manifested inside the reactor facility. By hour 18 of their quarantine, Doc noticed that the medical staff was paying particular attention to their neurological responses, specifically their reaction times and their ability to perceive depth and spatial relationships. And when he asked a young nurse what they were testing for, she hesitated before quietly admitting, "They want to make sure you're still existing entirely in 3-dimensional space, that you haven't been partially displaced into wherever those things came from." On September 19th, 48 hours after the incident, Doc was transferred from decontamination to what was termed a secure briefing facility, which turned out to be a windowless conference room deep in Hanford's administrative complex, where he found himself facing a panel of 7 individuals representing agencies he'd never heard of and departments that seemed to have no official names. A woman who introduced herself only as Dr. Sarah Winters, historical consultant for Interdepartmental Research Coordination, presented classified files spanning decades and continents. Documents that revealed N7 was merely the latest in a series of similar incidents that governments worldwide had been documenting and suppressing since at least 1945. She showed him photographs from the Soviet facility near Chelyabinsk dated December 1957, showing a reactor complex that had been hastily buried under hundreds of tons of concrete after what Russian reports described as uncontrolled spatial distortion, resulting in catastrophic containment failure, and the accompanying documents translated from Russian with extensive sections still redacted, described personnel experiencing translation into non-standard geometric configurations and entities, manifesting that demonstrated properties inconsistent with matter-based life as currently understood. There were French documents from a facility near Grenoble in 1968, German files from experimental reactors in Bavaria during the final months of World War II, and most disturbingly, American records from Hanford itself, dating back to 1951, that documented the discovery of that crystallized concrete and included handwritten notes from a Manhattan project physicist warning that the site demonstrates properties suggesting dimensional instability. Recommend immediate cessation of all high-energy operations pending further study, recommendations that had obviously been ignored. Dr. Winters explained in a clinical tone that certain locations on Earth appeared to have naturally occurring weaknesses in what she called dimensional membrane integrity, places where the barriers between different forms of physical reality were thinner than baseline and that extreme energy. Concentrations, particularly the specific type of thermal and radiation flux produced by nuclear reactions, could stress these thin points to the breaking point. She showed him equations that Doc's engineering background allowed him to partially understand mathematical models, suggesting that what they'd always thought of as three-dimensional space was actually a projection of higher dimensional structures, and that under the right conditions, those structures could become perceptible, CS cold, even become navigable by entities that had evolved or developed in frameworks where additional spatial dimensions were normal as length, width, and height were to humans. At 0312 hours on September 21st, 3 days after the initial incident, Doc was awakened by alarms and immediately transported back to the temporary command post that had been established at the edge of the expanding exclusion zone, now grown to nearly 3 square miles as the effects radiating from N7 intensified, rather than diminishing as containment specialists had hoped. Seismic monitors were detecting rhythmic pulses originating from the reactor core, vibrations that one geologist described as almost like breathing, occurring at intervals of exactly 7.3 seconds with a regularity that natural geological processes simply didn't produce. When they accessed what remained of the security camera feeds, the monitors showed that the interior of N7's containment vessel had undergone further transformation, the space inside now appearing to contain volumes that were geometrically impossible given the building's exterior dimensions, corridors extending in directions that couldn't fit within three-dimensional space, and rooms that seemed to exist in multiple locations, simultaneously depending on the angle of observation. Chief Hernandez, who'd been kept under heavy sedation in the medical facility, suddenly awakened at precisely the moment those seismic pulses began, sat upright, despite restraints that should have been impossible to break, and began speaking in that layered voice, using phrases in Proto-Akkadian that the linguist on duty frantically translated. As the boundary is thin here, they are learning our shape. 7 have crossed, but 70 are waiting, and when the temperature reaches the threshold again, they will come through as we did, wearing flesh like we wear these forms. Doc watched through observation glass as Hernandez's eyes, still completely black and seemingly depthless, tracked movement that no one else in the room could see, and when he asked what she was looking at, she turned those impossible eyes directly toward him and said in perfect English, layered with a dozen other voices they want you to understand that resistance is a choice you're making based on fear of transformation. But transformation is inevitable. You've already been changed by exposure. You're already becoming capable of perceiving from their angles. And within weeks, you'll begin to see what I see, what the others see, the spaces between spaces where they've always existed, watching, waiting, curious about the strange limited creatures who move through only 3 dimensions and experience time as a linear progression rather than as a landscape to be navigated. The other 3 personnel who'd been transformed alongside Hernandez, scattered across different medical facilities for observation, all awakened at the exact same moment and began speaking in perfect synchronization, their words identical despite being separated by miles. And Doc understood with sick certainty that they weren't 7 individuals anymore, but rather 7 sensory organs of a single, distributed consciousness that was using them to observe, to learn, and to prepare for something larger. At 0347 hours, the entities within N7 attempted their first expansion. Beyond the reactor, building 7 quasi-physical forms, emerging from sealed doors and moving through the exclusion zone, passing through vehicles and prefabricated structures and leaving behind areas where materials had been fundamentally altered at the molecular level. And when a security team attempted to engage them with small arms fire, the bullets passed through the entities without effect and exited moving at velocities and trajectories that violated ballistic physics, as if the space the entities occupied didn't share the same physical constants as baseline reality. At 1847 hours on September 21st, 4 days after the initial incident, the N7 facility experienced what seismologists would later struggle to classify not an earthquake, but rather a localized inversion of gravitational constants that caused the entire reactor building to sink approximately 7 feet into the ground while simultaneously appearing to expand outward its walls, bulging as if the interior volume was increasing beyond what the exterior dimensions could contain. The exclusion zone established around N7 had grown to encompass nearly 3 square miles as personnel across that area reported identical symptoms: severe nosebleeds, temporal disorientation, where minutes seemed to stretch into hours, and the overwhelming sensation of being observed by vast attention from angles that didn't exist in normal three-dimensional space. Doc Whitmore and 15 other personnel with various levels of exposure to the anomaly had been consolidated in a temporary command post when they all simultaneously experienced what psychiatric evaluations would inadequately describe as shared psychotic episode. But what actually happened was that for approximately 40 seconds, all 16 individuals perceived reality from the perspective of the entities within N7, seeing the Hanford site and themselves from impossible angles that revealed space and time as static dimensions that could be navigated as easily as walking through a room. 2 technicians began screaming and didn't stop for 6 hours, their minds unable to reconcile what they'd perceived with the limitations of human neurology. A Marine security officer named Corporal Vincent Shaw grabbed a marking pen and covered every available surface with drawings of geometric shapes that mathematicians later identified as projections of 4-dimensional objects into 3-dimensional space, and he kept repeating, "They're not invading. They were always here. We're the ones who just appeared in their space, and now they're curious." Chief Hernandez had been restrained to a medical bed, but the restraints were found broken with metal torn, as if subjected to impossible stress, and she was discovered standing in the center of the command post with 6 other personnel arranged in a circle around her, all of them with those same black eyes, now all speaking in perfect unison in that layered voice that bypassed ears and installed meaning directly into the minds of anyone who heard it. The temperature throughout the entire exclusion zone had become unstable in a pattern that defied meteorology, some areas experiencing snow despite it being September in the desert, while adjacent zones sweltered at temperatures approaching 120 degrees, and the boundary between hot and cold zones wasn't gradual, but sharp, a line you could stand with 1 foot in winter and 1 in summer. Equipment was failing not randomly, but systematically, as if something was learning how human technology worked and testing different ways to interfere. Radios would transmit for exactly 30 seconds before cutting to static. Vehicles would run normally until their drivers tried to leave the zone, at which point engines would die and computers displayed data that was temporally impossible, showing events that hadn't happened yet or that had happened hours ago as if they were occurring in real time. At 21:03 hours, as full darkness settled over the Hanford site and the temperature differential between zones created fog that hung in the air like something solid, the N7 reactor building completed whatever transformation had been occurring over the previous 4 days, and what remained was no longer a structure that existed entirely in baseline reality, but rather an anchor point where another form of existence was bleeding through into our dimensional framework. The building's geometry had become hostile to human perception. Walls meeting at angles that hurt to observe directly, windows that showed views of spaces that couldn't fit within the structure's exterior dimensions, and a front entrance that seemed to recede away from anyone who approached it, despite the distance remaining constant when measured. The 7 shadow entities that had been visible on security footage were now manifesting outside the building, no longer confined to the reactor core, but moving freely through the exclusion zone. And they were no longer entirely shadow, but taking on quasi-physical forms that resembled human shapes, the way a child's drawing resembles. A photograph recognizable but fundamentally wrong in proportion and detail. These entities moved through solid matter as easily as through air, passing through vehicles and buildings and leaving behind areas where materials had been subtly altered, concrete that had become slightly translucent, metal that bent under no force but remained deformed, and in 3 locations, patches of ground where the dirt had rearranged itself into crystalline structures that grew visibly, spreading outward at a rate of approximately 1 inch per hour. Doc found himself with a rifle he didn't remember picking up, standing in a defensive position alongside 12 other armed personnel, all of them understanding intellectually that bullets wouldn't stop entities that didn't fully exist in physical space, but unable to override the human instinct to hold weapons when confronted with threat. Chief Hernandez and the 6 others who'd been transformed by direct contact with the entities had begun moving in coordinated patterns, tracing shapes on the ground with their feet, and where they walked the earth beneath them turned black, not the black of shadow or night, but in absolute absence that seemed to extend downward infinitely. And Doc realized they were creating a larger version of whatever geometric pattern had existed in that underground cavity. They were building a doorway at a scale that would allow the entities to cross over not individually, but en masse. The sky above N7 had taken on colors that don't exist in natural atmospheric phenomena. Bands of ultraviolet and infrared that became visible to human eyes as reality's rules bent far enough. And within those impossible colors, shapes moved that were vast beyond comprehension, suggesting that the 7 entities in the exclusion zone weren't independent beings, but rather small portions of something far larger that existed mostly in spaces perpendicular to human perception. At 2,147 hours, the ground inside the pattern that Hernandez and the others had traced began to sink, not collapsing but rather opening, revealing a space beneath that shouldn't exist because geological surveys showed solid basalt for hundreds of feet down. And from that opening came a sound that wasn't quite sound, but rather a vibration felt in bone and teeth, a frequency that carried meaning without language, and every human within a mile radius understood simultaneously and with terrible clarity that the entities were extending an invitation, that the doorway worked both directions, and that humanity could choose to step through and experience existence from their perspective, could volunteer to be transformed as Hernandez had been, could become the bridge between 2 forms of reality. And the alternative to accepting that invitation was that the entities would continue spreading outward from N7 at an accelerating rate until the entire Columbia Basin, and then the entire Pacific Northwest, and eventually the entire world existed in that state of dimensional overlap where physics were negotiable and human biology was optional. And Doc found himself actually considering it, found himself taking a step toward that black opening, found himself thinking that maybe transformation was better than resistance. And that thought terrified him more than anything else that had happened, because he recognized it wasn't entirely his own thought, but rather something that was being suggested to him by minds vast enough that human will was as easy to redirect as water flowing downhill. At 2,152 hours on September 21st, just as Doc Whitmore felt his own will beginning to erode under the psychic pressure emanating from the open doorway beneath N7, just as he found himself taking involuntary steps toward that absolute blackness that promised transformation into something vast and incomprehensible, 3 U.S. Air Force C-130 transport aircraft appeared over the Hanford site, flying in formation so tight and so low that their approach was felt as much as heard, a thunderous presence that seemed to physically push back against the dimensional intrusion that had been expanding from the reactor facility. The aircraft had appeared on no flight plans, had not communicated with any air traffic control, and later investigation would reveal that the pilots themselves couldn't adequately explain why they'd diverted from their scheduled route or how they'd known to carry the specific cargo that turned out to be humanity's only effective weapon against an incursion that conventional physics had no framework to address. The lead aircraft began deploying approximately 40.00 pounds of an experimental chemical agent that classified documents referred to only as XK9, a substance developed during highly classified research into non-conventional warfare that had been deemed too unpredictable and too dangerous for standard military use. Chief Hernandez and the 6 other transformed personnel collapsed simultaneously the moment the chemical agent made contact with the black doorway they'd been creating, the absolute darkness receding from their eyes to reveal normal human pupils again. Though those eyes now held an expression of profound loss, as if they'd been connected to something infinitely vast and had been violently severed from it. Within minutes of the initial chemical deployment, follow-up aircraft began arriving with cargo containers of specially formulated concrete mixed with additional XK-9 agent, and a construction operation that would officially never appear in any records began working around the clock to entomb the entire N7 facility. Doc watched from the command post as thousands of tons of the concrete chemical hybrid were poured directly into the open doorway and over every surface of the reactor, building a material that hardened with unnatural speed into a seal that geological surveys would later claim was molecularly denser than any naturally occurring substance on Earth. By 0600 hours on September 22nd, less than 8 hours after the chemical deployment began, N7 had been completely encased under a dome of crystallized material that rose 40 feet above ground level and extended at least 200 feet down into the Earth, a tomb that was designed to contain not just radioactive materials, but something far stranger and far more dangerous. The survivors were separated within hours each, transported by unmarked helicopter to different medical facilities across the continental United States. And Doc found himself in a Department of Defense hospital in rural Virginia, where he would spend the next 14 months undergoing what was officially termed radiation exposure treatment, but which actually consisted of experimental pharmaceutical protocols designed to disrupt the formation of new neural pathways and make existing memories feel distant and dreamlike. He was visited weekly by psychiatrists who seemed less interested in his emotional recovery than in cataloging exactly what he'd perceived during the incident, how long he'd maintained eye contact with the entities, whether he'd experienced any unusual dreams or sensory experiences since exposure, and whether he felt any compulsion to return to Hanford or to seek out other locations where dimensional membrane integrity might be compromised. His military career was quietly ended with a medical discharge, his security clearances revoked, and he was given to understand through carefully worded conversations that speaking about N7 to anyone outside of authorized briefing sessions would result in consequences that were never explicitly detailed but were implied with sufficient clarity that he never tested those boundaries. Chief Hernandez and the other 6 transformed personnel were institutionalized in separate psychiatric facilities diagnosed with conditions that had no standard names but which medical records described with creative vagueness as service-related dissociative disorders with neurological complications. And all 7 would die within 15 years of the incident from causes that autopsies attributed to various forms of organ failure, but which pathologists privately noted showed tissue samples containing crystalline inclusions that shouldn't be biologically possible, as if their bodies were slowly being converted into something that wasn't quite organic matter anymore. The exclusion zone around N7 was expanded to a full 5-kilometer radius, officially justified as precautionary measures against radiation contamination, but actually maintained because instruments continued to detect anomalous readings from the sealed facility. Temperatures that fluctuated in possibly seismic activity that suggested something was still active beneath the crystallized dome, and electromagnetic disturbances that caused equipment failures in personnel who ventured too close. The entire incident was classified at levels that existed beyond top secret, buried in archives that required presidential authorization to access. and a cover story was constructed involving a conventional reactor malfunction and radiation. Leak a story that was simultaneously boring enough to discourage civilian interest and alarming enough to justify the permanent restricted status of the affected area. And in the decades that followed, the truth about what had actually happened at N7 would be known to fewer than 50 individuals, worldwide a secret kept not through threats or intimidation, but through the simple fact that anyone who'd been directly exposed to the phenomenon either died, young, went insane, or learned very quickly that speaking about interdimensional incursions and reality-bending entities was an excellent way to be diagnosed with severe mental illness and lose all credibility permanently. The official record states that no reactor designated N7 ever existed at the Hanford site, that all documentation referring to Sector 7 Gamma was the result of filing errors and administrative confusion during the chaotic transition period when the facility was being reorganized in the late 1970s, and that Sergeant Dylan Whitmore received a medical discharge in April 1980 due to post-traumatic stress disorder related to his service in Vietnam, with no mention anywhere in his 247-page military file of his assignment to any nuclear facility in Washington state. Chief Petty Officer Lisa Hernandez's records show that she died on March 15, 1983 at age 27 from complications of a rare neurological disorder that 7 different specialists at 3 separate medical institutions examined but could never adequately diagnose a condition that caused her brain tissue to develop crystalline inclusions that pathologists described in hushed conversations as minerals growing in patterns that resemble circuit boards more than any biological structure. The other 6 transformed personnel, whose names were systematically removed from all official rosters, and whose families were told different stories ranging from training accidents to sudden onset mental illness, died between 1984 and 1994, none reaching age 40 their death certificates listing various causes, but autopsy reports when they existed at all and weren't immediately classified, noting identical anomalies in their neural tissue, crystalline formations following geometric patterns that one coroner photographed before his film was confiscated, and he was informed that he'd actually examined a different body entirely, and any memory he had to the contrary was mistaken. Dr. Raymond Caldwell, the Los Alamos physicist who'd been weeping with scientific ecstasy as reality collapsed around him, continued working on classified projects through the 1980s and 90s, but colleagues noted that he'd become obsessed with what he called intersection points, locations where dimensional barriers were naturally thin, and he spent his final years before his disappearance in 1997 traveling to sites around the world, including Sedona, Arizona, the Bermuda Triangle, and an area near Dulce, New Mexico, where he was last seen checking into a motel with equipment that included electromagnetic sensors and what witnesses described as modified radio equipment that he said could detect frequencies that weren't exactly electromagnetic. His rental car was found abandoned on a desert road with his personal effects inside, his research notes scattered across the back seat, and his final journal entry dated the morning of his disappearance, reading, "I can feel them again. The way I felt them at N7, they're here too, everywhere. Actually, we've always been swimming in an ocean of dimensions we can't perceive, and I finally calculated the right frequency, the right temperature, the right mental state. I'm going to try making contact on my terms. This time I'm going to show them that we can be partners rather than specimens." Air Force Colonel James Reeves, who'd coordinated the chemical weapon deployment that sealed N7, was promoted to brigadier general in 1985 and spent the remainder of his career overseeing what unclassified budgets vaguely referred to as anomalous threat assessment and containment, traveling to sites around the world where similar incidents had occurred or might occur, and in his final interview before his death from pancreatic cancer in 2015, conducted by a researcher whose recording was immediately classified, he allegedly stated, "We didn't win at Hanford, We bought time, maybe decades, maybe a century if we're lucky. But that seal is degrading, and we don't have any way to repair it because the XK9 was never successfully synthesized again. After the original batch was used, something about the manufacturing process that worked in 1979 can't be replicated with modern equipment, as if the chemical itself was only possible under conditions that don't exist anymore, or that we've lost the knowledge to recreate. The physical evidence of the N7 incident was systematically destroyed or buried under classification levels that effectively remove it from accessible history, with the reactor facility itself entombed under that crystallized dome that continues to emit low-level anomalous readings that monitoring equipment detects, but that official reports attribute to residual radiation and geological settling. The underground cavity that had been discovered during construction, that perfectly spherical chamber with polished basalt walls showing exposure to impossible temperatures, remains sealed beneath hundreds of tons of the concrete chemical hybrid. But seismographic data that's been leaked by 3 different whistleblowers over the decades shows rhythmic vibrations originating from that depth, pulses occurring at intervals that have been slowly decreasing, from 7.3 seconds in 1979 to approximately 6.1 seconds as of the most recent measurements in 2023, suggesting that whatever the cavity represents or contains is becoming more active rather than less, despite being buried under materials designed to last for geological timescales. The XK9 chemical agent that proved effective at disrupting the entity's manifestation was never successfully reproduced after the original stockpile was depleted at Hanford, with chemists at multiple classified laboratories reporting that while they could follow the synthesis procedures documented in 1970s research notes, the resulting compound lacked the specific properties that had made it effective, as if some crucial element of the original formula had been omitted from documentation, or as if the chemical's effectiveness had been dependent on conditions that no longer existed or couldn't be recreated in controlled laboratory settings. Intelligence reports from the 1980s and 90s, partially declassified and heavily redacted, revealed that the Soviet Union, China, France, and the United Kingdom all experienced similar incidents at their nuclear facilities, with the Soviets reporting at least 4 separate spatial anomaly events between 1957 and 1986, the last occurring at Chernobyl just weeks before the famous reactor explosion. And internal KGB documents suggest that what the world knows as the Chernobyl disaster may have actually been a containment failure of an entirely different nature than radiation release, with eyewitness accounts from the immediate aftermath, describing shadows that moved independently and workers who came back from the reactor hall but weren't quite themselves anymore. The patterns are consistent across decades and continents. High-energy nuclear reactions in locations with geological anomalies create conditions where entities from dimensional frameworks perpendicular to our own can manifest partially or attempt to cross over fully. The entities demonstrate intelligence and curiosity rather than hostility. They attempt to communicate through transformed human intermediaries, and in every case, governments respond with immediate containment, classification, and systematic erasure of evidence, while simultaneously studying the phenomena in hopes of either preventing future incidents or weaponizing the contact for military advantage. The exclusion zone around the sealed N7 facility remains today, officially maintained as a radiation contamination site, though the actual radiation levels have been below dangerous thresholds for decades. And Hanford, site workers report with uncomfortable frequency that the 3-kilometer restricted area experiences phenomena that safety briefings do inadequately prepare them for, including electronic equipment that malfunctions in specific locations, vehicles that suddenly lose power when approaching certain boundaries before starting normally again once they retreat, and the persistent sensation of being observed by something vast that exists just outside of normal perception. Satellite imaging of the area, when researchers can obtain uncensored versions, shows subtle but measurable anomalies, including color shifts in certain spectra that don't match the surrounding terrain. shadow patterns that don't correspond to the position of the sun, and thermal readings that fluctuate between extreme cold and extreme heat in the same locations within minutes, despite no apparent heat sources. Local residents in the towns surrounding Hanford, including Richland and Pasco, have developed an informal culture of not discussing certain experiences, a collective agreement to dismiss as stress or imagination, and moments when time seems to skip when they see movement in peripheral vision that vanishes when observed directly, or when they experience dreams of vast geometric spaces populated by entities that watch with intense curiosity. And the few who do speak openly about these experiences find themselves gently ostracized their accounts, attributed to mental illness or attention-seeking, despite the consistency of reports across unconnected individuals. Temperature records for the Columbia Basin region show anomalies that climate scientists struggle to explain, with the area around Hanford experiencing localized warming at rates significantly higher than global averages, and more disturbingly, experiencing temperature spikes that last only minutes, but register increases of 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit before returning to ambient, events that occur with increasing frequency and that monitoring stations detect, but that official weather services attribute to equipment malfunction, despite the readings being consistent across multiple independent sensor networks. Perhaps most concerning are the seismic records, data that require specific clearances to access, but that leaked versions show unmistakable patterns of rhythmic vibrations originating from the sealed and 7-site pulses that have been accelerating from their initial 7.3-second intervals in 1979 to current intervals approaching 5 seconds, and geological models suggest that if the acceleration continues at current rates, the interval will reach zero, meaning continuous activity, rather than pulses sometime between 2035 and 2045, and no one in any official capacity will discuss what might happen when that threshold is reached. The truth about N7 and similar incidents around the world remains buried under classification systems designed to outlast the careers and lifespans of anyone involved, protected not primarily by government secrecy, but by the simple fact that the reality of what occurred is so incompatible with consensus understanding of physics and biology that most people would reject the evidence even if it were publicly released, dismissing authenticated documents and eyewitness testimony as elaborate hoaxes, because accepting the alternative that our three-dimensional reality exists adjacent to or embedded within structures with additional spatial dimensions populated by intelligences vast enough to make human consciousness seem like candle flames compared to the sun would require abandoning too many comfortable assumptions about humanity's place in the cosmos. The entities that manifested at N7 demonstrated no hostility, no aggression, only curiosity and a desire to observe and potentially communicate with forms of consciousness different from their own. And yet humanity's response has been exclusively defensive, treating their appearance as invasion rather than first contact, choosing containment and suppression over understanding and dialogue. And that choice may be the most tragic aspect of the entire incident, because it suggests that when we finally faced with intelligence truly alien to us, intelligence that doesn't share our dimensional framework or our temporal experience, our instinct is fear rather than wonder. Doc Whitmore's final journal entry, written the night before he died peacefully in his sleep, at age 74 perhaps, captures the essential tragedy and the lingering question that the N7 incident poses. I've had 40 years to think about what happened, 40 years to wonder if we made the right choice by sealing them away, and I still don't have an answer, because yes, they were terrifying. Yes, what happened to Hernandez and the others was a violation of everything that makes us human. But was that violation something they were doing to us, or something that simply happened when our form of consciousness tried to exist in their framework? Were they attacking, or were they trying to help us adapt to perceive what they perceive? And if I could go back, would I still shoot Dr. Chun, or would I let him complete whatever transformation was happening? Because maybe, just maybe he was becoming something that could serve as a true bridge between their reality and ours, something that could translate between dimensional frameworks and make peaceful coexistence possible rather than just containment and mutual fear. The sealed dome over N7 continues to emit those rhythmic pulses, the intervals continuing to decrease, the temperature beneath the crystallized barrier continuing to build toward some threshold that no living person fully understands, and deep in classified archives that fewer than a dozen people can access. Contingency plans exist for what to do when that seal finally fails. Plans that range from tactical nuclear strikes to complete evacuation of the Pacific Northwest to, most disturbingly, protocols for managed transformation of volunteer personnel who would be deliberately exposed to the entities in hopes of creating stable human entity. Hybrids who could negotiate terms of coexistence. And the fact that such protocols exist suggests that somewhere in the labyrinth of classified government programs, someone has concluded that the entities will eventually cross over fully, regardless of our containment efforts, and that the only real choice humanity faces is whether we'll meet them with weapons or with open hands, whether we'll cling desperately to our three-dimensional existence or accept the invitation to perceive reality from their impossible angles, and that choice, whenever it comes, will define what humanity becomes in ways that evolution over millions of years never could. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.